We need to start this podcast with an opening monologue, an opening dialogue.
Yeah, I think it should be you reading a poem, a soliloquy.
I did look up best quotes from Where the Sidewalk Ends.
Yes.
This boat that we just built is fine, and don't try to tell us it's not. The sides and the back are divine. It's the bottom, I guess we forgot.
Classic.
There, you wanted me to read some poetry?
That was it. Shel Silverstein.
You got it, man.
From conversations to the natural world to complete silence, so many of us focus on what's next rather than what is happening now. I'm Listening is a podcast that dissects the importance of listening.
I'm Drew Richmond.
And I'm Brand Christofferson.
And this is I'm Listening, a podcast simply about the skill of listening. All right, folks. So we have our very special guest today. We're very excited to bring him in. This is Ty Phelps. And Ty, will you do me the favor of explaining what your background is, why you're sitting on this podcast with us right now, and what draws your interest to poetry?
Sure. So I'm pretty much at this point a lifelong educator. I got my start in summer camps, one in particular, and then wound up getting a teaching degree. I taught high school English for 7 years and started doing a bunch more writing during that time, and then went and got my MFA in fiction and nonfiction. But I've also written some poetry and I've studied some poetry. And as a high school English teacher, one of the things you wind up having to do is justify to your very skeptical students as to why they should give any amount of effort into understanding or seeking to enjoy poetry. And so I developed a little spiel about that. So I'm here to talk partly as a writer, partly as a teacher, partly as a poetry enthusiast. And also, I guess, and I'm a musician. I'm not really a singer or anything, but quite a bit of overlap in terms of poetry and songwriting in different genres. So I wouldn't describe myself as an accomplished poet, but I got a few poems that live out in the world, and that's a nice feeling.
Awesome.
Very cool.
And this
Very
is
cool.
also an excuse for Drew and I to catch up with folks we haven't talked to in a really long time.
It has been a minute.
Just excited to be able to catch up with you, too.
It's really good to see you guys.
Yeah.
It's really good to see you, too. And I can't believe how fast, 10 to 15 years goes. It's pretty incredible.
It is.
Yeah.
Ty, tell me about how you first got interested in poetry. When did it start to click in your mind that this is something of stronger interest to you than maybe most others or other people that you were friends with or around or your family? Where did that stronger influence of poetry come into your head there?
Well, I remember it was high school. I remember being a little jealous of my younger sister, Kate, who's also an excellent poet, a very, very good writer. And she won an award in middle school for a poem she wrote. And I was like, at that point, I had already been writing some goofy stories like Ninja Carrot Man, just stupid, silly stuff. And so I fancied myself a writer a little bit. And I thought poetry was a way to sound profound. And I did write some very overworked, very just horrifying poems in my early high school days. But I found in English classes that I really didn't connect to it as a reader. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't particularly enjoy it. And that changed when I was assigned T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land with a group of peers in my AP English class. And we just went nuts on that poem in terms of analysis and interpretation and trying to understand all the references. And there was a lot of scholarship to dig into because it's so well known. And that's when I started to get interested in it intellectually. I still don't think I was that interested in it aesthetically. I didn't read poetry for fun yet. I didn't connect with poetry really personally until college and it was the Romantic poets and William Blake and some of Wordsworth and Coleridge that I started to be like, oh, there's something here that makes me feel things, not just make me think about things. But I didn't really try to write poetry until quite a bit later. And it was what drew me into trying to write it was that it felt achievable. Like I could finish a draft of something in one sitting. Just because it happens to be short. It might be a bad draft, right? It might take me just as long to make it good as it would take me to make a novel good, right? There's no timing necessarily, but it felt right. And I wanted to write, and I had kind of been shutting myself down about it. So it was a good kind of entry point into just letting myself try. And that eventually got into some other stuff. Yeah, so that's, I guess, kind of my history. And then, I started meeting poet friends and reading their work. And we have a mutual friend, Matt Nenow, who's done some wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
A couple of really, really nice collections and some really fantastic pieces. That's kind of how I arrived here.
Cool. When you came from having that experience with your sister to writing and overworking stuff, and then to reading it with enjoyment and interest, and then back to writing again, you talked about that achievability, right? Of I can sit down and write a draft in one sitting, which, hey, I accomplished something, right? Versus writing a short story or chapters of a novel, which take years. Go back to that part about writing a first draft to finishing a draft. Like, how do you know when you've got a first draft and you're like, this isn't it, but there's something there? And then on the other end of that spectrum is, I overworked the crap out of this thing. And how do you get to getting from that thought out on paper originally to a finished product that's ready to be out there in the world?
Well, I mean, and this is actually a good segue kind of into the listening process, right? Like listening as we talk about, I teach my students that revision literally means re-seeing. And so the idea is to try to come to something as fresh as possible. And remember that just because you put something in and it felt like the thing to put in, that was still a choice. You didn't have to make that choice. You could have made a different choice. And revision can help you start thinking about those different choices that you make. Some of that is practice, learning to listen to yourself. And some of it is like getting feedback from other people and listening to them and deciding what of those suggestions you think are going to help your piece versus not. What's going to change it. Very often, other people's feedback is, you have to walk a line, because if you take everyone's suggestions, you completely lose what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
So getting more comfortable with revising and with sharing your work and just being like, I am starting to like this. What do other people think? Being open to that sort of exchange of ideas, sort of being vulnerable with this thing that you've been working on.
Yeah, vulnerable is key right there.
Yeah.
Do you have a memory of a first time when you said, I'm going to share this with someone else? What was that for you? What was that like?
I think honestly for me, one of the real breakthroughs actually, and this has nothing to do with poetry, but it does have to do with listening and performance. And one of the things was program announcements at Camp Manitowish. Mm-hmm. When I realized that I felt somewhat comfortable in front of an audience, and when I realized if I could get people to laugh, then the comfort would really come. My first poems that I shared with other people were ones that I thought were funny. Okay. I think because it was easier for me. It was like, I don't have to be quite so like emotional and real. And maybe those sorts of things sometimes feel forced. Like humor to me feels a more natural state sometimes than ponderous emotion, even though
you're going to get vulnerable with somebody.
You
can be vulnerable with someone with comedy, but being vulnerable with someone on another emotion is a little harder.
It's a little scarier. So I think that was the start of it. And and it was the listening to the immediate feedback, right? That's one of the fun things about doing a reading as opposed to your work living on the page. I know we'll kind of get into this more later, but you get to actually experience the reaction from the audience, whether that's laughter or applause or someone coming up after you saying, hey, I really liked this. Or sometimes when you read something and it bombs, right? Like stand-up comedians talk about this, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just the wrong night. Sometimes it's the wrong mix in the crowd. Sometimes you're just not on, or you picked the wrong set of things to read or whatever. There's that kind of immediacy, and then it becomes interactive.
Going off of that a little bit more, because what we're talking about is, you can write it, you can read it, you can listen to it. We actually didn't get into the fourth component, which is presenting it. You talked about that immediate reaction, that feedback that you're getting from the audience. Describe that a little bit more in terms of what that does for you as the presenter of poetry.
What are you listening for?
Yeah, what's your connection there?
I'm kind of listening to myself. Like, how am I pacing this? Am I saying things the way I want them to be said? Very often, I wind up revising a piece sort of like as I'm reading it, like not with a pen and paper, but I'm like, oh, this word's out of rhythm, or this is a better way of saying this just occurred to me, and I'm going to get away with it because nobody knows, right? It's not like I'm reciting famous stuff. Like maybe a friend in the audience has seen a version of it. It's not like it's super well-known stuff at this point. I think something that an audience might be able to like laugh at or respond to or be surprised by is great, because then there's that auditory reaction, and that helps me, for sort of performer mode, kind of relax. I'm pretty comfortable in front of an audience. I'm a classroom teacher. I'm a musician. I've been on stage in lots of different ways. Reading is different because it's just you. It's not you and a bunch of other people. People have chosen to be there. They're not there because they signed up for your class. And like you're sharing something that's, I think, maybe a little more, I'll use the word vulnerable again. It just feels a little more naked to be out doing that. I'm comfortable performing, but when I'm doing a reading, very often, like the paper will shake in my hand a little bit. Hearing some of that audience reaction, it just soothes me. It brings me that confidence that's like, no, they're getting something of value from this, even if it's a moment of amusement. Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
So there is that. It's almost connection, right? Because there is that vulnerability. You're not just sharing someone else's work. You're sharing your own work, your own words. And there is that fear that I might be saying this and it might not be connecting. Mm-hmm. It might be way off. They might not receive it the way I'm hoping they receive it. So that feedback then kind of gives you that immediate, okay, they got it. Mm-hmm. They're getting it. This is great. I'm able to make that connection.
Yeah, it helps a lot, at least for me. And that is different, right? That's different than a poem on the page. A poem on the page is doing also different things, right? Like there might be the way the poem is arranged, like the white space, the stanza choices, where the lines break, things that you might not, a reading might not give you that information, right? Sometimes you might hear little pauses at line breaks, and some poets, when they're reading, exaggerate those things more than others. But I tend to, if I'm at a poetry reading, what I'm hoping is that the language will feel natural, will feel like it has a flow that makes sense in speaking, and then how it's arranged on the page might provide a new window into like a different kind of meaning. You get to see different kinds of choices.
So it's kind of distinguishing the difference between an audio medium and a visual medium.
100%. And poetry is really visual. That's the weird thing about it, is more than any other kind of writing, the layout is significant. The line length, the arrangement, the use of white space, the kinds of stanzas, whether or not you're using a established form or doing something more kind of free-flowing or experimental.
Yeah.
And
why is that? Where does that come from? Because when you say that, I think of liner notes in my albums, right? Or I think of E. Cummings, the poet, and his just way of putting stuff on a page. But yeah, why? Where does that come from?
Well, I think, and we can get into, and I'm not like a historian of this stuff, but I can give you the kind of general overview. I think because poetry originated as a oral form, and pretty much everything, old stories, right, until the advent of really the novel as like a prose and meant to be sort of read individually, kind of emerged in the late 1600s. It was, like Daniel Defoe and, some of those kind of really early novels. But before then, like, most stuff had at least elements of poetry, right? You had Canterbury Tales was written in verse, even though it's narrative, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey written in verse, meant to be recited, even though, they're narrative, they're storytelling. And some of that was, I think, to aid the ability to memorize and have those kind of rhythms and help the audience absorb it. And then you get to Shakespeare, and a lot of Shakespeare is written in blank verse, right? Iambic pentameter, more or less, sometimes rhyming, often not, like laid out discreetly in verse. And then you've got the fact that it's drama, right? And it's not just the words being spoken, but it's all the actors doing the thing. And it's another very kind of visual and audio mix, but narrative. And I think poetry was subject to pretty strict rules in terms of what constitutes what. This is a sonnet, this isn't. This is a villanelle, this isn't. This is in heroic couplets, and that's the way we do things. And eventually, as that, really intense syllabic, 10 syllables, with these emphasis, once that kind of stuff started to break down and more loose or experimental or poetry that was pushing against those restrictions started to emerge, well, you're going to start seeing that not just in how things sound, but also in how things look on the page.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what the strictness of the rules, and for good reason, right, in terms of just how we follow these things and the value of repetition, the value of form, given that it was primarily like an oral tradition kind of thing, or at least originally. I think it makes sense that as we got to the modern era and people were starting to push against every kind of rule, that poets were doing that same thing. The forms they were choosing or not choosing, and the way they were lining things up, and sometimes using language almost like an impressionist painter, where it's not even making real sentences. It's just word, and there's maybe some resonance and some between the lines stuff. A lot of that stuff I don't find particularly enjoyable to read. I find it philosophically interesting. I don't really want to. It's like the difference between experimental music and like, what do I want to listen to in the car?
Right.
I can appreciate the ideas behind it, at least.
Yeah.
One of the things that Brant and I have been talking about is the use of poetry, reading it to kids and having children's books, the Dr. Seuss, etc. We actually talked about how it's visually laid out on the page and how it's, short fragments of sentences or, just a few words. And it's easier to digest as a kid, not only listening to it, but also to start reading it, because it's not just, 500 words on a page that you have to, it's these little snippets, and each, it might be 4 or 5 words, but it's a little block, right? So it's a little block of words, or it might be 7 words on a page, and you're like, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's very, at that age, listening to it, it makes sense, right? There's that rhythm, it's soothing, it's maybe a little bit funny, it's a little goofy, but you can start to picture it, right? The really good ones, you can visualize what's being said and what's being discussed. You get that emotional piece behind it, but you can digest it. It's not this like massive thing that again, this is at my level, which is we're talking Dr. Seuss poetry here.
You've read hours of it to your kids when they were younger, though. So.
Oh yeah,
right.
Oh, yeah.
But it's still why does it still resonate? Why do I think of that? Because I think, and this goes back to maybe some of its origins, it's digestible. You can understand it. You can comprehend it. You can memorize it. You can hear it or read it just a couple of times and it kind of sticks with you, versus a novel where you understand the idea and maybe snippets of it. But it's really, in some cases, again, at my elementary level, it's digestible. You can understand it and retain it.
Yeah.
And I think rhyme and rhythm are big retention aids, right? It's why they're such good teaching tools for young children. It's why we can remember song lyrics better than a free verse poem that, a few listens and we can start to kind of, because there's the rhythm to it that we're hearing, right? There's usually rhyme and repetition, which helps aid in memory because you're not just getting the meaning in your memory, you're also getting like there's like little signposts of sound that aid in the retention. And even working with college students, they have difficulty sometimes with big blocks of text. So like a really dense paragraph of narrative theory, right, is going to be harder to read than 2 slightly less dense paragraphs of the same information, just because it's like stopping cues for your brain, right? Like, okay,
yeah,
here's the end of and this is why I can get on my high horse with my fiction students in particular. This is why formatting matters. This is why we have punctuation. This is why we have indents in your essay. This is why I care about the stupid MLA rules, not because the rules inherently are important, but because anything that gives the reader clarity is of value. And a lot of that comes down to formatting, layout, how things are arranged, right? How dense is your information? When are you making choices to pivot? What transitions are you using? And in poetry, that comes down to meter, it comes down to rhyme, it comes down to visually, like when do you end a line? It's often advisable that you track that just the end lines, doesn't matter what form you're using, because the last word in a line is going to stand out to the reader. So those words need to be vibrant, interesting, not prepositions or or try to find a way to break the line in a spot that has something a little more significant, because you're automatically giving that word that added weight by choosing to end the line there. And so, if you're writing in very strict rhythmic thing, sometimes your choices are made for you. I remember a college professor, we were talking about Keats, and I think Keats is a really incredible talent. But, there was lots of elves in his poems. And it's like, well, because there's only so many words that rhyme with self. And he's, writing a lot about the self. And that was a big thing that was going on in those times. And so, there's elves, because what else are you supposed to do at that point in the English language? It's shelf, it's elf, that's it, right? There's not much else.
Yeah.
So, sure.
I'm glad he wasn't writing about oranges.
Yeah, we dodged a bullet there. He might never have made it. None of the great
never would have known his name.
Yeah, if he had been trying to write about oranges, it would have really been rough. Yeah. The main thing I'm trying to do is with the students when I talk about that stuff is they mostly haven't been told why, right? Why is this stuff important? And so, one of the things I'm trying to do is I guess kind of peel back the curtain. No, it's not just rules that we made for no reason. These are things that actually can really impact the success or failure of how you're presenting your ideas, right? Which is about that, to bring it back to that audience connection. Are they getting it? And it's harder when your work is being read by someone on the other side of the planet, quietly in their room or whatever. You have no control over if they're getting it or not, other than the words you chose to use. When you're presenting something in person, you have a little more control, because you can add gesture and facial expression and all these other, the tone of your voice, how you phrase things. And it's funny because some of my favorite poets, and I won't name names, but there are some poets who I love on the page, and I've seen them read. I would rather read it on the page than hear them.
Sure.
And other people, when they read something and I didn't quite connect with it, and I hear them read and it's revelatory. And it's just it just got in so much deeper. And so I think it totally depends on the poet, depends on, their skill both on the page and as a reader, which are separate skills. It depends on the audience. My feeling of connection in that moment might be totally different from the person sitting next to me, who maybe isn't enjoying the way this person reads or whatever. Because so much of it is subjective and taste-based and everything. But
So when we talk about this, it's written, it's read, but is it really supposed to be listened to? You would be in the court of it's all three, because some aspects of it really are better read than listened to. But for those that are writing it, it's an outlet, right? And it's a passion and all of those components. But for some, when it's presented or when it's read aloud and you can get that physical emotion, it's going to hit very differently than if it's just read on the page. And some poems need to be that way to have their impact come across.
I think that's 100% it. That in some cases, it's really valuable to hear it. In other cases, it's really valuable to read it. In many cases, I would say you're going to notice different things as either a listener or a reader, one way or the other. And as a writer, right, or presenter, it's also, all these sort of different things that you wind up thinking about. So it is really one of those forms where, I think you can get a lot out of it either way.
The one of the questions I wrote down is actually before even having this conversation was, I want to hear more about your approach to teaching it. Early on, you said when you approach teaching this to others, whether it's high school kids or college kids or whatever it is, you have to justify it. I thought that was a fascinating word. Can you go into that a little bit more in terms of why that word? Was that an intentional word? And have you perfected the justification of poetry?
Perfected, maybe not, but I've got a pretty solid response because, of course, right, of all the things kids learn in high school, analyzing a poem seems pretty far removed from most of their day-to-day reality, right? And we don't always do a good job as teachers of explaining how these skills are transferable, or what's the value of this kind of thing. Algebra is the same. It's when am I going to have to do this? And it's you might not have to, but you might have to. But what you're really learning is problem solving, trial and error, logic, following procedures, understanding the way to set up a problem and try to figure out how to get to the end result of it. Those are the transferable skills. Yep. And with poetry, it's reading, it's attention, basically. It's paying attention to the words on the page, because the writer paid very deep attention in poetry. And in longer form writing, each individual word has less impact. But in poetry, each individual word has enormous impact. That's the whole purpose of it, is that distillation of some sort of profound moment, profound thought or idea or little flicker of something. Maybe it's an emotion, maybe it's a thought, maybe it's an image, but it's a distillation. And it's often trying to dignify the inner life of an individual, that it has an internal component, even if the poem is about something seen. Again, it's the poet has brought their attention to that instance, right? And is then trying to convey basically a one moment of experience. And then you've also got that, okay, so that the analysis stuff is useful. And then writing poetry is really useful because it teaches you precision, right? It teaches you to employ sensory language, sensory detail, imagery, which tends to connect to readers more effectively than other things. It teaches figurative language like metaphor and simile. Again, wonderful teaching tools and communication tools. How many times have we tried to explain something to someone and the direct explanation fails, and then so instead we say, well, it's kind of like this, and then the light bulb goes on, right? So
sure, yep.
So those kinds of things are why I think we teach it. It's about honoring private experience, honoring perspective, learning to pay close attention to language and to think about choices, and to be able to connect to the small in a world that often feels sort of overwhelmingly big. It's about a single moment, usually, a single experience from one perspective, right? And what matters is the transmission, or the attempted transmission of that, because an experience being put into language, something's going to be lost. And then from poet to reader or listener, something's going to be lost, right? But the attempt is the thing. That's all we've got, right? Ursula Le Guin said, we're all of us alone, to be sure. What can you do but put your hand out in the dark? That's what being a person is. And I think that, so that these are the kinds of things that I tell them, and that usually shuts them up. And then like, okay, yeah. Well, I think one of the things that poetry can do, because it's a language form, is lots of things in life feel unexpressible. Like we don't quite have the words to describe the feeling. At least most of us don't. A really talented poet is somehow able to put language to things that feel inexpressible, that they can transform usually through really deep specifics, an experience, and then create some sort of universal feeling that, for whatever reason, I don't know why this is the case, but we can only connect to the universal through the sharing of the specific. And this is why specific details in writing are always more effective than vague details, is because the specific makes things come alive, and then we can see ourselves in that, even if it has nothing to do with us. But if you can connect that profoundly to a huge number of people, it's like, a great song or a great movie. These kind of things is why we bother making stuff.
Yeah.
I think, it's putting your hand out in the dark. See who's going to grab hold. No, this was lovely, and thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. Go read some more poems, listeners. Nothing changes your day and makes you slow down like reading a small thing carefully.
I love it.
That's a great piece. And hey, Ty, you keep doing what you're doing, all right, man, because we need people like you in the world. Keep writing. Don't stop writing. Keep being a good human, and thank you for spending some time with us.
Well, so good.
Right back
so
at you.
So good to see you again.
Yeah. Oh man, no, I can't wait to start listening to these once you get them rolling.
Yeah, it'll be in
2026.
Yeah, 2026.
2026 is the
Good. Gives me something to look forward to.
one podcast. It's 7 hours long, and it's coming out in 3 years.
That'd be amazing.
It has to be experienced in that 7 hours. You can't break it up. You just
straight.
We'll have a
And if you play it backwards, it lines up with Dark Side of the Moon.
Right.
Yeah.
which
We'll have deprivation chambers you lay in to.
I was going to say there should be a global just a day of rest for the whole planet. Right, we all listen at the same time.
Yeah, that's.
They bet.
I mean, that's our goal.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see if it comes out.
Yeah, world domination.
Shoot for the stars.
You never know.
Thanks. I really appreciate you reaching out, and thanks for having me. And what a lovely conversation. And good luck to both of you.
So
I think
fun.
this is a cool idea.
The podcast is I'm Listening. We're talking about poetry. The whole idea was you can write it, you can read it. Is it really meant to be listened to? I think that through our conversation, poetry is concerned, it's all three. And actually, we learned of a fourth dimension of this with our conversation with Ty, not only being the listener of it, but also being the presenter of it and sitting up on stage and presenting or performing this piece is kind of this fourth dimension that we didn't even think about. So it really hits on all four. But what we did really land on is that vulnerability piece, that emotional connection to it that you can get while reading it. But when it's performed for you or when it's read to you, that's when you see that human emotion behind it. Poetry is all around us. It comes down to a certain level of vulnerability. It comes down to rhythm, and it comes down to style, and it comes down to how it's presented on the page.
It comes down to being heard, right?
Yeah. It comes down to being heard.
Being heard, at making a connection, getting that something across to someone else in an effective way that not a lot of other mediums can do.
And if you're really good at it, it fills in the blanks to a lot of things that other humans just can't put their finger on. They can't place it. It creates a link to other emotional components to help us understand things and to help us remember things.
Coming up next, we're going to get into air travel and all of the things that go into traveling by airplane.
Sitting in the airport, nobody listens to anything until the captain talks, and that's what everybody listens to.
Really?
And they are the worst. And they are the worst talkers. Yeah, so have a nice flight. And you're like, what the fuck did he just say? I don't understand. This is the one thing I want to listen to. That's the whole premise of the next podcast.
I love it. So our podcast today has been flying at the altitude of 30,000 feet. Special thanks to our guest today, Ty Phelps. This podcast is created and produced by Drew Richmond and Brant Christofferson, edited by me, and music by Drew.
That's me. In this description of the podcast, you'll find more information about this topic and to see any sources that we utilized during this podcast. So be sure to check that out if you are interested.
Hey, it's a good thing we're recording this.
Yeah, because that worked out really well. Bye.